Thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to be amongst family, and that's what I feel. And it's also, I've been sitting there with a huge grin on my face since we've been in worship, and you'll understand why by the end of my sermon. I think God is amazing. So I have a really great episode to do with you today. And I say the word episode advisedly. I've been introduced to box sets. And I know that box sets run from one thing into the next. And it's really difficult to stop at the one you're supposed to be watching. You want to go on to the next one. They tempt you further. Well, I think we're in a box set at the moment, which started probably when Joshua, that's very formal, Josh, sorry. When Josh started us off with this installment of Acts that we've been following in Acts 21. And you know, I would really love to advise you to read Acts 21 through to 23, so you get a feel of the whole story of Paul being in Jerusalem. So today we're in a very exciting installment. All sorts of things were happening. So, if I was leading the box set, if I was directing from the box set, I would have to say to you that at this point we're going to have some pretty sinister, dark music as a background. So bear that in mind. But where did we leave Paul last week? Well, we left him in prison. But we left him with the words that we find in Acts 23 and verse 11. Which Martin directed our thoughts to. The Lord stood near to Paul, and he said, "Take courage. As you testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Now we know that because we've been following this, that he is on his way to Rome. That's his great desire. And here we have the wonderful presence of the Lord comforting him and reassuring him at that time. But the truth is, Paul is still in prison. He's still confined. He's still not able to go where he wants to go. There's still nothing he can do about getting to Rome. And, you know, that's a really difficult place for Paul to be in. We know that he's made it known to the Romans that he is, in fact, a Roman citizen. And that means that he shouldn't be actually kept in jail at all, or in prison at all. He shouldn't have been flogged, which is why they stopped suddenly when he said, hang on, I'm a Roman citizen. And so there were various things that he needed. He needed to have a fair trial. And as such, he shouldn't have been in prison, but he was. And you could say he was in the Antonia fortress, which was right next door to the temple, if you remember, so that the guards could look over to the temple grounds. You could say he was there for his own safety, because he was going to be torn to pieces by the people in the Sanhedrin otherwise. But how would he get to Rome? At that point, he really didn't know how it was going to happen. So we'll start our passage today, and we've got quite a long passage, I have to say. We're Acts 23 and verse 12. So remember the sinister music in the background there, because the situation now looks very dark. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We've taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about this case. We are ready to kill him before he gets there." So if you remember, as I say, the Antonia fortress was right next door to the temple, but at this point in time, Paul is secure in the prison, and the plot is to get him out of there. Now, bearing in mind who we've just been praying for, and I'm very much reminded of this, when you think about the fact that Judea, which is where Jerusalem is, was under Roman occupation at that time. And all that feeling that comes with having overlords had all the power. The Romans were a military force. They were an economic force. They were a social force. They had power. Now, they would say that they brought roads and infrastructure in cities. They would say that they brought security. They brought a clear taxation system. But it's also true that they were drawing resources out of the country to support the Roman Empire. So it's not surprising that at the same time there were groups of people who were freedom fighters who were actually trying to actively stop the Romans achieving their goal. And so it wasn't uncommon to have a group of people who would gather together and would do anything against the Romans, and in fact against anyone that said things or did things against the Judaism, their own faith. If you remember when Matt preached, he talked about how the Jews felt about their faith was a nationalism. He suggested it was much like our football, but I'm not going to go down that line, especially as I'm a cricket supporter, and that doesn't work at all. But for the first century Jew, it was really important that they were unique. They were God's chosen people. And so, first of all, you had the Romans who were against that, but you also had people like Paul who had the temerity to stand up and to actively do things against their faith. And so it isn't surprising that these 40 men took such a strong oath and said that they would kill him very happily. Now, so at that time, you have the insurrections, you have groups of banditti or sicari who would carry knives with them. So it was quite clear how they were going to do it. They were going to get Paul out of the fortress, and it would be very easy for them to have a knife under their cloaks and be able to kill him and the guards with him. But on the other hand, it has to be said that they were taking a risk, because if they were caught, if they were unsuccessful, they would certainly have been executed. Because the one thing the Jews could not do was to kill in the name of their faith. So we have the Romans and we have this group of men. But then we have the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders. You've been told time and again about the 70 men who controlled the Jewish faith. They took control, they cared for it, whatever they said went. This was made up of Pharisees and teachers of the law, Sadducees and Herodians, people that came together, but together they were responsible for what happened in the faith. They were responsible for what happened in the temple. They were responsible for what happened across the country in terms of the religion. They kept the law of Moses and all the traditions legalistically. Now, having said I've been introduced to box sets, I would say to you that one of the things I do enjoy is a prequel. Rather than a sequel, a prequel. And at Christmas time, I went to the cinema to see a prequel, which helped me to understand a bit more about a series of films that I like, but I'm not particularly promoting, which is of the Kingsman series. And this prequel went back to the First World War to try to explain why things were happening as they were at that time. Now, I'm not going to give you anything away on that score, but it was very helpful for me to see where it came from. Another prequel that I've enjoyed over the years is Endeavour, which explains why Inspector Morse was such an irascible police sergeant, or police detective. You know, Endeavour series is just aimed at trying to explain to us why Morse turned out the way he did. So if I was going to do a prequel at this point to try and explain about the Sanhedrin, I would have to go back to the life of Jesus, which isn't that many years before we're talking about here. And the Sanhedrin had the responsibility to work out if somebody really was the Messiah. They were constantly looking for somebody to come and to free them from the Romans and to set them up and to really put forward the Jewish faith again. That's what they were looking for. And from time to time, people would rise up and say, I'm the Messiah, and gather a group of people around them. Well, what happened was that they had a particularly worrying case of this. They had to assess the likelihood of whether that person was the Messiah. And this particular one came from that backwater of Nazareth up in the north. Now, remembering that the Sanhedrin are in the temple in the south in Jerusalem. And here's that man up in the north, and he seems to be gathering a whole group of people around him. And so the Sanhedrin sent out people to watch him, to listen to him, to challenge him. And Jesus turned around and accused them of being hypocritical and of leading people astray. So it's not surprising that the Sanhedrin had assessed his claim as being a false Messiah. In fact, they even went further to say his actions, his power, came from the devil himself. That's how they felt about Jesus. And so eventually they were able to hand him over to the Romans and get them to crucify him, which is what the Romans did. Can you imagine how upsetting it was when that man's Jesus is following? Their followers actually claimed that he'd risen from the tomb. Well, the Sanhedrin's own guard had stopped the disappearance of the body. And so many people were claiming that they'd seen him alive. There were 500 on one occasion. And then, on the day of Pentecost, in the temple, in the Sanhedrin's own domain, on the day of Pentecost, thousands believed in this Jesus. Well, you can imagine how this had really stirred up the Sanhedrin. How did they get to this point of wanting to, and agreeing to killing Paul? They were grateful for Paul because he had been their champion. He had been the one who'd been going around persecuting people. He'd been chasing after these people into other areas where they had fled. And we know that he'd seen a vision on the road to Damascus. And he, as far as the Sanhedrin are concerned, had become a turncoat. And not only that, but he was going into all the synagogues of the surrounding areas and teaching about this Jesus and the new way. So although they hadn't seen much of him in Jerusalem until this point, he had the gall to come into the temple, as we've heard in the last few weeks, and to take part in a ritual. He was seen by people who had seen him out in the outlying areas and knew that he'd been mixing with Gentiles, people who are not Jews. The gall of the man, that he should come into their temple. And it wasn't surprising that they dealt so strongly with him. So strongly that it was only the troops who'd saved him from getting torn apart. So he was taken into the prison, if you remember, Paul was. And then the commander of the prison wanted to determine what the problem was. Was it against the Romans or was it against the Jewish own law? And so he asked them to debate. And you remember what happened there. That didn't turn out too well. It wasn't the Sanhedrin's finest moment when they actually turned on themselves, because the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, but the Pharisees did. And that was the point that Paul pointed out. So it's true that here we have a religious body of people who are not working towards not even their own scriptures. In fact, Jesus had said that they had called them out on the fact that they didn't know what their own scriptures were. So it is quite possible for people to go to church, to appear to be very religious, but to be ignorant of what the Bible actually says. Well, I wonder what happens next. We know that the plot is set. We know that they've got to get Paul out of the prison to get into the temple. And on the way, somehow, there are 40 of them, so it should be possible. They would get through the guard and they would kill Paul. So let's find out what happens next. Acts 23, verse 16. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He's got something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They've taken an oath not to eat or drink until they've killed him. They're ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you've reported this to me." It's an adventure story, isn't it? This is a situation in which we've got the plot, we've got it all ready to go, but somehow this young man has overheard. He knows what's going to happen. Unfortunately, Luke doesn't give us the details. I want to know, how did he overhear? Was it a case of you had a young person in the corner there and you thought they weren't listening? Now, I've learned that's not a very wise thing to do. Children can hear what you say. Was it that somebody perhaps had bragged about it? Somebody from the Sanhedrin or somebody from the 40? How did he know? Well, we don't know, unfortunately. But what we do know, that he was in the right place and at the right time. Now, I didn't, until I started to study Acts again, this time through, I didn't realize that Paul had a nephew, or even a sister to have a nephew. But he does. But he's not even named. A nephew is all we know about him. But having heard what he had to do something about it. Yes, it was his uncle, but yes, also, it was an unjust thing. It was something that was wrong, clearly. And having heard it, he had the courage to do something about it. Now, when I say courage, I mean he had the courage to go against his own leaders. Being a Jew, he was going against his own leaders, and also he was going into the Roman fortress. Now, some of you will know that I spent 10 years in prison, working, I would say. I spent 10 years working in prison, and for anyone coming into prison, it was really quite a scary thought. Having the gates locked behind you, feeling that you were locked in, not really knowing what was going to happen. It's always a scary thing to go into a prison. And here he was going into the Roman fortress. What would happen to him? What would be done to him? It was a risk that he took. So clearly family were allowed to go into the prison to perhaps give Paul food or to care for him, and that was true then. So he is able to go in to see Paul. Paul sends him off to the centurion, and the centurion on to the commander. Now, remember what Martin told us about the commander last week. This poor man, he's in the worst situation, really. He could have been sent to England or Britain, as it was at the time, but he actually had to serve in Judea. And here is the commander, and this is what he's going to hear. So, verse 23. Then the commander called two of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. We're going to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found out that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." Now, this commander had a difficult situation here. He was often having to deal with the Sanhedrin as the religious rulers of the country he was overseeing. He had to take now he knew about this plot against his prisoner, his person who was a Roman citizen. He couldn't afford for anything to happen. The situation was really tricky. But he's obviously a commander for a reason. He makes a definite decision of what to do, and he makes it quickly. So now's the right time to move the problem on. This is something that I'm not really wanting to do, so I'm going to move it up the chain of command and on to the governor, who was living at Caesarea. So what does he do? Here's this commander. He asks for 200 soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 cavalry for one man. It's amazing, isn't it, to think that this is going to happen. And imagine, if you go back to my scenes of the films and that, imagine all that noise of all the horses getting ready and the men getting ready and everyone getting their equipment together and the noise and the excitement and here we have this huge exit at 9 o'clock at night. I think this is amazing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, think about that letter. It's a bit of a selective retelling of the events, isn't it? He says that he didn't know he was a Roman citizen. He didn't know he was a Roman citizen when he rescued him. It sort of gives the idea that he probably did know, but he didn't. But it still would have been against the rules for the Jews to kill him. He doesn't mention imprisoning and almost having him flogged before he then found out he was a Roman citizen. And in fact, he hadn't yet told the Sanhedrin, but he was going to. Now, there isn't anything unusual in that, is there? If you are writing a letter and you're writing about what you're doing and you're wanting to impress your commander, then you too would probably do the same kind of thing that we find that Claudius Lysias does. So let's keep going. Verses 31 to 35. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought them as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's place. So what the commander says happens, which is what you would expect. Paul is taken the 100-kilometer journey to Caesarea, stopping at Antipatris on the way. And he's going towards Rome. And so in our series of events, the story is to be continued, as all stories would be. Now, when I come to think about this whole episode, which can be I think is very exciting, there are a few things I want to pick out. One of them is that we have a corrupt religious authority in the Sanhedrin, and we have a religious, zealous group of religious men. Now, they're going to break their Roman law, but they're also going to break their own Jewish laws by what they're seeking to do. And we want to avoid becoming in any way corrupt or legalistic in our beliefs. And so we need to know our Bibles. We need to meditate on God's word. We need to be sure of what is right. And we also want to be sure about what is happening in front of us by other people. People can appear to be religious, can't they? They can appear to be Christian. But do their lives and their morals reflect their true biblical teaching? That's a challenge for anyone in leadership or overseeing a church or in a situation. But it's also a challenge for us as members, because we need to know if something's not right. We need to be able to say and stand up against Scripture that this isn't right. That's our check on these things happening. So we need to know our Bibles too. Another thing that I think is really important here is Paul's nephew. He was a very small cog in a large story of the large wheel of the story. so insignificant, he's not even named. Now, I wonder if you ever feel like that. Do you feel that you're not important? I meet people quite often who don't feel that they are important enough to be used by God. This tells us differently. This tells us that God used this one single young man. He didn't know how things would sort out once he'd told Paul. He didn't know how important his role was. But what he did was, having heard, he acted. Now, I wonder if you've ever done that. If you've been in a situation where you've just been following a prompt from God, you don't know what's going to be the outcome. I can think of a couple of times from my own experience. One was on Hyde Station in Manchester. I had the opportunity of a conversation with a young man. And in that conversation, he mentioned the names of his children, and they were all Bible names. So, of course, I sort of said, oh, yes, my children have got Bible names too. Do you go to church? And that started the conversation about the fact that he used to go to church, but he didn't anymore. And so he began to talk about his feelings there. So, of course, I encouraged him to go back to church. Now, I don't know what happened to that young man. Don't know his name. I don't know what happened. But I hope in glory I will meet him and he'll be able to say, you're the person that spoke to me on the train station. That's what I hold on to. It's just being able to do what God prompts us. And then, as I said, I had some time in teaching in prison, and my students generally knew that I was a Christian. And one stayed back as the class were going and said, Miss, will you pray for me? I'm due at court tomorrow. I know that I have let God down. I haven't been to church, and I've really had a shake-up by being brought into prison. Will you pray for me? So I was able to pray for him. I didn't pray for his right answer in the court, but I prayed for truth and for justice. And all I know is he didn't come back the next day. So I don't know where he went. But it's really important when you have the opportunity to act on it. Whoever you are, God can still use you, just as he used Paul's nephew. The nephew was available, and he acted on what he heard. And it proved to be a really important part of God's plan. But not only does God use individuals, he uses the whole of the Roman law and military organization. And this is a bit that I think is thrilling when you think of where we've been this morning in worship. Paul could not have imagined how he was going to get to Rome, or even how he was going to get out of that prison. He couldn't have imagined how it was going to happen. He was there in prison. He wasn't able to make decisions for himself. How many times have we been reading his story and we found he's left the city under cover of darkness? But never has he gone with 470 people guarding him. It's amazing. What an incredible outcome for him. And it was for his safety as much as anything else. But I see this as God's planning and his sovereignty over everything. Not only does God speak and say, take courage, but God acts. And this is the bit where I hope you'll have a grin with me, because I found the verse in Ephesians 3, verse 20, when it says, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. And both Daniel and Ransom have talked about situations which were impossible, and yet with God, it was amazing how it happened. I think having 470 people to guard you out of the city is an incredible situation. So I wonder if those things have happened to you in your life. Have you seen God do some amazing things? Well, I thank him that I have. And one of them, I've had permission to share it with you. But when Pete and Mim moved to Shrewsbury, they came to live with my husband and I for a time. Now, the idea was that then they would be able to go and rent their own house. Pete was earning a good wage at the times, but things went wrong, and he ended up with a job that was less well paid. Mim was expecting Jacob, so she couldn't work. But after 6 months, It began to feel a bit heavy for all of us. It wasn't just for G and I. It was for all of us. We all began to really want to see a way out. But how was it going to be possible? They couldn't afford to rent. It was just not possible. And then, or as a Lady Joyce Curtin would say, but God. A couple from the church here was sitting behind G and I in a meeting. And God told them to rent out a house to me, Pete and Mim, for half the rent of the cost of the rent for 2 years. Can you imagine having a phone call from them to tell us that, and us to be able to share that with Mim and Pete? It was amazing. Absolutely amazing answer to our prayers. It was beyond our imagination. And another example I would give to you, because you've heard from Martin now about how things have moved on with Word Online. Well, as one of the directors, I remember going to see some Christian fundraisers, and our hopes were this wide. We wanted funds to do this. And when we left the meeting, he brought us down to this, French translation. Now, I would say that I'm sure I wasn't the only one who came away disappointed. The only other thing they said was, you need to go back and speak to Relay Trust and find out what they're offering. And of course, when Martin did go back to Relay Trust, they were offering this, And it's a case now where we can see that Word Online will actually not just be translated into French, but will go into Africa and will be overseen by this bigger charity who are able to take it on. It's an amazing answer to prayer. So we have a young boy who is used to foil wickedness. We have a powerful army just to keep Paul safe. But over it all, we have God's authority and God's plan for Paul's life. Now, God's plan for your life may not be quite as dramatic as that. But I would encourage you to look for the times when God works through other people, through situations, through individuals, through organizations. And his intervention in your life will be dramatic at times, certainly effective, timely, and so often extravagant. I'm going to invite the band to come up, simply because I thought, we're doing this quite often at the moment, having the band to come up. You can come up now, folks. But I really can't leave it there. If we've got this extravagant God who gives us more than we can ask or imagine, and he has a plan for your life and for mine, how can we not worship him? That was my feeling here. We need to worship this extravagant God. We need to trust him to work out his plans for our lives, knowing that he can and he will do more than we can ever ask or think. Amen. Thank you.